Welcome on in. This is Viv and this is Art with Viv. Now I already traced out my Bulldog onto my Pantone card, and this Pantone card is called Fur. It is a nice blue-green, and I traced it out with some pastel pencil so that it would show up. You can also use color erase pencils, anything like that is lighter than the background. And of course I started with the eyes. I always like to start with the eyes. I did sort of a yellow ochre for the iris, and then he has some black, I call it his makeup. He got some makeup on, got a little eyeliner on, and I actually did use tube black for that, and for his pupils as well, and then a little tiny white dot in those pupils, of course, for the highlight. And the whites of his eyes, I did not use pure white, because if you look at the whites of any animal's eye or any human's eye, it is not a pure white. So I added just a tiny touch of gray to that, a little bit of black or a little bit of gray, or you could use a little bit of blue mixed with your white. But most whites of the eye are not pure white. So just keep that in mind. It won't look natural if you make it that stark white. So I've got the whites of the eyes. I'm going with my black, putting his eyeliner on, those lower lids and upper lids. I always love that about Bulldog's eyes. They have that dark rim around them, and they just look like they have the most beautiful makeup on. I also put a darker brown line around the iris of the eye, because this Bulldog has a darker ring around the iris on the outside. And I'm just adding in a little bit of the whites of the eye on the other eye as well. And I am using my golden maple detail brushes. I love those for gouache, and I am using gouache. I forgot to tell you that at the beginning, but we're using gouache. I also treated the card with a layer of clear gesso, because it has that shiny surface. Those Pantone postcards have a shiny surface, and it's hard to get gouache to stick to it. It will peel off, flake off. So to prevent that from happening, I always do a layer of clear gouache. Now the next thing I'm doing is I am putting on some of the base layer of color for his face, just being really careful and trying to be mindful of where his color is brown, where his color is white, and also lightening up that brown with just a little bit of yellow in some spots, maybe a touch of white, just so that we have some contrast. I really love gouache. I had just fallen in love with it this year. I've said that before, but I'm really falling in love with how easy it is to blend, how easy it is to correct mistakes if you need to. You can layer colors over each other. And now I'm using traditional gouache, not the acrylic gouache. I haven't used the acrylic gouache yet. So I do have to be careful when I am putting layers over other layers, that the first layer that I put down is completely dry first, because regular traditional gouache will reactivate and it can blend in with your top layers, and sometimes that's not the effect that you want. So be careful with letting those layers dry before you add layers on top of them. Also, to keep your gouache from cracking, you'll want to start with thinner layers with a little bit more water added to the paint as your first layers, and get a little thicker as you go toward the top layers. That'll help prevent it from cracking. If you put thick layers on first, really thick layers, then try to cover those with thin layers, it will not dry evenly, and you have a chance of your gouache cracking. So you don't want to do that. That's just a little tip there to, help you in the future. If you ever have that problem, you'll know that it's because you put your first layers on much too thickly. Alright, so I've gotten part of his eye on this side of his face done. Now I'm starting into the white parts. For some of the shadows in the white, I'm adding just a little bit of violet, a little purple in there. The other good thing about gouache is if you want to blend, you can do the wet on wet. Now I just talked about letting the layers dry so that it doesn't interfere with the color of your top layer, but the reverse is true. If you want to blend in a color into your first layer, then while it's wet, it will blend beautifully, smoothly. So that is why I love gouache. You could do it either way. You can use wet into wet technique where you blend two colors beautifully, or you can layer lighter colors over darker colors. And of course you can always do darker over light and it will cover up the light colors. You can fix mistakes. So yes, I am in love with gouache. So what I'm doing here on his face is I'm just trying to get the lights and the darks sort of mapped out, and then as I go I'm blending them a little bit, just trying to tweak them here and there. I'm using a lot of browns, so I'm using like a burnt sienna, a burnt umber. Actually I don't think I even have a burnt umber. I think I might be just using the burnt sienna with a little teeny bit of blue mixed into it. But if you have burnt umber, that would be perfect for this. I'm using a little black, and I'm also using a little bit of blue, a really pale blue for the highlights for his wrinkles, and a little bit of purple for some shadows in the white parts of his face. So that's how I'm thinking about it. I'm wanting a little purple, little blue for the shadows for the lightest parts of his face. For the darker, browner parts, I'm putting in a little bit of blue for highlights, and that just makes it look more visually appealing. It's a little more contrasty, and I just like the way that it looks. So I'm gonna let you watch for a little bit, let you enjoy some music, and I will return shortly. So for the inside of his ear, I used a little bit of the brown and a little bit of red to mix it together to get that sort of browny pink color. And then for the lighter areas, I just mixed a little white into it. And for the darker areas, I mixed just a little bit of like an alizarin red with a teeny tiny bit of blue, so it leans a little bit purple. And that's how I decided to work my palette for the ear, that pink palette. So it's basically just brown and red, a little bit of white, and a little bit of alizarin, crimson, or either a rose color. Whatever you have in your stash, that's what you should use. Now I put that first layer down of white paint for the white parts of his face. You saw I already put in some purple shadows, but now I am just putting in that first wash. I'm calling it a wash. It's not really a wash. It's just really thin gouache with a lot of water. Like I told you, I want to paint thinner layers first and build up to a little bit of thicker layers so that it'll dry more consistently and evenly. And I'm paying careful attention to where the highlights are and where the shadows are. Now for the white, again, I'm just adding a little bit of purple or a little bit of blue for those shadows. Where his fur is white and it's in deeper shadow, I'm adding a little bit of blue because that seems to be a cooler area. It's not in any kind of light at all. It's in less light. But for his face wrinkles, the light is shining more directly, so I went with the purple. And in this case, it's more of a reddish purple, which is a warmer color because more light is getting to those shadows. Even though it's in shadow, those are warmer shadows. And the neck shadows under his chin and around his neck are more blue, more gray, because they are cooler shadows getting less sunlight. So I hope that makes sense. And I'm just adding a little bit of texture on top of some of his wrinkles. And as you can see, I apologize for my lighting. The sun is starting to shine. It was getting later in the day. The light was starting to shine right into my window. So the lighting is a little bit cattywampus, and I apologize for that. The next thing I'm doing is I'm starting on his nose, and I'm using black straight from the tube. And then with that black, I'm mixing a little bit of blue and a little tiny bit of white to make kind of a bluish gray. I want it to look more blue-gray than just a flat gray, so that's why I added a little bit of blue in there and a little bit of white to lighten that up. And I'm just going over the planes of his nose, the surface areas of his nose, and trying to get the correct lightness and darkness of each little part. I'm trying to move it into the light so maybe you can see it a little bit better. And in the darkest areas, which are his nostrils and that little line down the, that separates the two sides of his nose, and it actually goes all the way down to the top lip, I put that in black. There's a really dark shadow right on the top of his nose from that nose rope. The wrinkle that goes across the bulldog's nose is called a nose rope. So that nose rope is casting a shadow right onto the very top of that nose. So that's why there's a dark shadow there. You want to think about that as you're painting. I'm coming in with a little bit thicker layer of that white paint, just trying to get it a little bit more opaque, a little bit brighter white. So I am enjoying that. I'm also kind of letting a little bit of the green shine through and trying to decide if that's what I want to do, or just add some more purple and blue to those areas for the shadows instead of letting the green shine through. You can do either one. And as you see, I'm going to let that dry a little bit. I am coming up and putting in some of the shadow with a grayer color around that nose rope and up on those forehead wrinkles. They had the cutest little forehead wrinkles. I love bulldogs. We had 3 bulldogs for a long time. We had a boy named Buck, a girl named Lindsay, and then another girl named Girly. Buck died first. He was our oldest, and then Lindsay followed not far behind him, and right after him, not really right after him, maybe a year or so later, then we lost our Girly girl. So all we have is our Darcy now, but I enjoyed having our bulldogs. They are so much like big babies. They are just the best family dogs. I love English bulldogs. So now I'm coming onto his nose and I'm adding some tiny white dots. They're not really white, pure white. They have a little bit of gray in them. And that's just to indicate, one, the highlights of the nose, but also the texture. Older dogs' nose get really bumpy. They have really a bumpy texture. At least my bulldogs did. I would try to put some balm on them, or it's sort of like a waxy, almost greasy type application you can put on top of your dog's nose to keep them from getting dry and cracked, but my bulldogs would just lick it right back off, so it didn't really do a lot of good. Now I'm trying to darken up some of those shadows, getting where the really bright highlights are, and then when some of the lower highlights that aren't quite as bright, putting those in and paying attention to that bumpy texture in the nose to make it look a little bit more realistic. I like the way his nose is coming out. So that's looking pretty good. And again, I am using my favorite brushes for smaller paintings with gouache, and that is the Golden Maple detail brushes. They are wonderful for gouache, especially for smaller paintings like this. I think these are only like 4x4 or not quite 4x4 inches. These little postcards where the color part is. So these are pretty small. And now I'm coming over there with my light sort of yellow ochre color. I don't think yellow ochre is the actual name of it. I'll have to look, but it's that type of brownish earth tone, leaning a little bit more toward the yellow. And then I'm mixing in some burnt sienna just to darken up some of the areas. Once I get that first layer in there, then I'm coming in with my white again for his other ear. And I'm trying to put it in thin, the first layer thin, staying with that rule of thinner to fatter. Just like you would do an oil painting, you would want to do thinner layers first and then finish with your thicker layers so that it all dries evenly. Because you don't want your top layer to dry first and your bottom layer is still drying, because once that bottom layer dries, if it's thick, it will crack. And we are trying to avoid the cracking. Now I'm coming in with my pinky brown color again, and I'm trying to paint in these sections based on how light or dark they are. For the darker ones, I'm adding either a touch more brown, maybe a little bit of a rose or alizarin crimson, a deeper color of the red. And for those midtones, it's red-brown with a little bit of white. And for the lightest tones, I'm just adding a lot more white to really lighten those up. And now I've got those shapes in there, and those are just based on how light or dark they are. That's what I decided to focus on, the shapes and the lightness or darkness of those shapes. So they've been painted in first. Later on, I'll come and refine them a little bit and get them more, more blended and more looking like an inner ear. Now this baby's nose has a little bit of brown around it, so I'm using a darker brown around his nose and lightening it up. I've even put just a touch of red in this brown, a little bit of red, a little bit of brown, and just a tiny bit of blue to just make it more of a cooler brown in some areas. Now I'm coming over with my white again, trying to lighten up some areas, give some really brighter highlights on the white parts of his fur. And then coming back under his little chin, getting that little chin brown on his bottom part. And just really trying to look at all the shapes and think about my shapes. I'm not thinking about painting a bulldog. I'm thinking about painting the shapes, and I'm thinking about how those shapes are situated and how light or dark those shapes are and what color those shapes are. So those are the things I'm trying to keep in mind. And I'm just adding a little bit of a lighter yellow ochre with some white mixed around those eyes. And now coming in with a really pure white down his muzzle. His muzzle is really light, plus it's coming towards you. So light areas come forward, darker areas recede. Since even though bulldogs don't have much of a snout, they have their little smushed in faces, his snout is still coming towards you. So I am doing that with a much brighter white to begin with. Then I'm going to come back up. My first layers of pink have dried, so I'm going in with a deeper pink, or I should say a more saturated colors of pink. And I'm sorry for the noise. The golf course that I live beside of is mowing their grass right now, so you might can hear their equipment over there, and it is quite loud. So I went in there and I just did some more concentrated pinks inside the ears, and I also heightened some of those highlights and made them a little bit brighter. and made some of the shadows just a little bit deeper. And like I said, you can do that by adding a little bit more red, maybe a little bit more brown into the pink mixture, or even some blue, like an ultramarine blue. Just don't overdo it. You still want it to be in the pink family range. So we're coming back now to his snout, and again, I'm trying to use pure white with no mixture in it to do my base layer. I want that snout to look like it's coming forward, and I want to have a nice good white layer before I start adding other colors. I want to have that base as nice and bright and white as I can. But you know, we are going to add some grays and some blues and possibly some purples to that as well. Now I'm coming with a pure white to add some more highlights, and then I am darkening up his bottom lip with some darker, deeper brown. You can also add a little bit of blue to that brown, or you can use 2 black, but I think in this case I just went ahead and used a little bit of ultramarine blue in there. Now his bottom lip is kind of hanging out from his top lip, and that is that same pinky brown that we used on the inside of the ears. We're just not going as light with the highlights, and we're going a little bit browner and a little bit darker with the shadow areas in that part on those lips. He's got his little baggy, wrinkly lips going on. I just love Bulldogs. I am loving this painting. I love gouache. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy I discovered it, because that has really just been such a pleasure to learn how to use gouache. And it has been relatively easy. I've been doing gouache for a year now, about a year, and yeah, I think I've come a long way, and I'm pleased with how well I'm learning how to manipulate the paint. So now we're going to do his tongue. I don't know why I did that really light area first, but then I changed my mind and went with more of a sort of a bubblegum pink almost for his tongue. Later on, I'm going to add some more brown to it to sort of tone it down, but his pink on his tongue is a much brighter pink than the inside of his ears or those side jowls there on his bottom. You know, his lips on his bottom is just a tad pinker. So I wanted to make it a little brighter, and I used the flame red is the actual color, flame red, with just a little bit of white and just a teeny touch of brown. You still want to put that brown in. You want it to look more natural. You don't want it to actually look like a piece of bubble gum, but you want it to have that brightness. Or at least I do. You paint yours any color you want now. That's the name of this game. Y'all paint your paintings how you want. You use the colors you want to use. That's the whole part of being unique and being artistic, and I highly encourage it. But I'm just showing you how I do it so that you'll have a nice jumping off point. You can watch me paint. You can see how I add the different colors in there, the different shades of blues and browns and pinks, and just make it work. And you can go off from that and you can make a whole new color palette for yours and mix different colors to get, you know, different shades or something that you think is perfect for you and your style. Your artistic instinct, go with it. Go with your instincts. My instincts have me doing it this way. Yours may have it doing a little different. Now on those front lips, that top lip right there on either side where his lips split right down the middle from his nose, I'm just adding some really pale pink texture there. He has some highlights. He also has some texture. So I'm just adding that texture by doing just tiny little dots. Now I'm doing a really pale pink. It's just white with a touch of pink in it. And I am going across his tongue, just doing tiny dots. His tongue has a little bit of texture, and the light is bouncing off those little tiny dots of his tongue. So I'm just putting that in there as well. Under his chin, I'm coming in with a little bit more white paint. I'm also going to mix it with some grays and some blues. And as it dries a little bit darker. And even though it is opaque, it is an opaque medium, some of that green does still seem to sort of shine through the white. and that's perfectly fine. I'm not mad at it. And I want to make this note. Now, some whites in gouache are a little more opaque than others. Right now, I am using one that is less opaque. But some gouache whites, you might want to try out some different varieties, some different colors. And I mean the color name, not necessarily a brand. Some are a little bit more opaque, depending on the name of it. So I will check that out because I can't remember which is which. I just want you to be aware of that. I mean, I can't remember which one is the opaque one because there's some different colors of white. But I am going to check that out, and I am going to report back to you as soon as I figure that out, maybe on my next gouache painting. So now I am doing, as you see under his chin, I went with the grays for the shadows and the blue because not that much sun is hitting right there. And then I did a pinkish gray shadow right under his neck. The reason it looks pinkish gray is because you can actually see his skin through his fur there. So it's reflecting just a little bit of pinky brownish gray color. So that's why that big shadow under his chin is that pinky gray color. Now I'm coming in with white. I'm painting in all the white areas of his fur, and then while it's still wet, I'm coming in with a little bit of blue, a little bit of gray for the shadows, painting those in, letting them blend on the edges. Then of course we are coming in on the other side of his fur with that same white. And remember, you can build up the layers, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. But I'm just getting those white areas blocked in and coming in while it's still wet with a little bit of the blue gray. It's a little bit of a cooler gray or a cooler shadow, so that's why I'm using the more grays and blues. And we have a body for our beautiful little bulldog. And he also has a little bit of brown right there past his white. This shadow is way entirely too dark and too gray, so I came back with a little bit more pink mixture on his shoulder as well, and then I blended it in with a little bit of gray, just sort of blended it out and lightened it up. It was much too dark. And this is the point at the painting where you want to start comparing your values and seeing, if something needs to be adjusted. If you need to lighten it up, you can add a lighter color on top of it. And of course, if you need to darken it, just add a darker color on top of it. But as you paint, you're always trying to compare your lights and your darks and your midtones to make sure that they're in this correct value range if you're trying to do something pretty realistic. And I'm trying to make this bulldog, fairly realistic. Not hyper realistic. I'm not into hyper realistic, but I do like realistic paintings. All right, so I have jumped over here, let it dry, and we're coming back to it. As you can see, I painted a little bit of green into the background as well, just to give it some texture. And I'm coming back with some pure white and painting over all the highlights on his face, just adding a little bit of highlight right over it, leaving the shadows. But once it dries, it gets darker. The white gets darker. Some of that green starts to shine through. So now I'm doing another layer of white on top to get it as light as I would like it to be. I'm also paying attention to where the shadows are, so I'm not painting over my shadows. I'm letting those shadows sort of shine through the white. And I am getting a little bit more happier with my results, which I've been happy the whole time. And you see that shadow under the chin ended up drying darker and grayer than I still wanted it. So I might have to fix that. But first I'm going to go ahead with these shadows and the white across the body and across his chest. We're just getting in some more of that white paint, layering it up, especially where we want it the whitest. On his little lips. So I'm just going to let you watch just for a second, and I will be right back. So I've decided that I need to just lighten up some of these areas over here on the brown part of his face, because once it's dried, they all look like one value. There's not enough contrast. So I'm just adding some of that burnt sienna, a little bit of yellow ochre, a little bit of white mixed together, just to give it some highlights. And of course, I'm not going to leave it like that because it's not blended in, but I'm just laying those highlights first, just mapping those out, trying to get them the right lightness or the right, darkness, whichever one. I'm going with lightness because we're doing highlights. Doing the same thing on the other side of his face. Or it could be a her, I'm not sure. His, her, my baby's face here. Putting a little bit of highlighter down the side of that face, and now I'm going even a little lighter in some areas where it needs it. And don't panic, I'm not going to leave it just like that. So now that it's dry, again, I'm coming in with a little bit more highlights. And as you see, every time it dries, it goes darker again. That is the one thing about painting on a surface that's already colored, like this green. It dries darker than it would on a white sheet of paper. That's another tip for you. It will dry darker. So I'm still teasing out these headlights. Not headlights, highlight. I don't even know what I'm talking about. I am tired. Now I'm putting in a little bit of the darker brown into some of those shadow areas. Kind of blending it out just a little bit, adding a little bit of more highlights in some of the lighter areas. And as you see, it's starting to come together again. It's not looking so disconnected, where the first time I laid down the highlights, everything looked a little bit disjointed, but it's all blending together. I'm putting in some really light lights, then I'm coming back with my dark color, putting that in, blending a little bit on the edges. And yeah, I like this a lot. He's looking much better. You can see those pretty wrinkles. I'm going to add a little bit of pink down here. This shadow's still a bit too dark for me, so I'm just adding in a little pink over it. And there you go. I think we have a beautiful bulldog here. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this. Thank you for watching. Shout out to my patrons. Without you, I could not be doing this. So thank you so much.